Blunkett resigns from the government for the second time within a year after days of controversy over his business interests.
So I am guilty of a mistake, and I am paying the price for it, and I make no bones about saying that that is my fault, and I stand by it.
The Prime Minister accepts his decision to stand down reluctantly.
Whatever mistakes my right honourable friend has made, I've always believed and believe now that he's a decent and honourable man who has contributed a great deal to his country, who has overcome immense challenges that frankly would have daunted the rest of us.
Well, we'll be live at Downing Street, where Tony Blair is considering changes to his cabinet.
And we'll cross live to Westminster with John Sopel for the latest reaction and analysis.
And the other headlines here on BBC News 24 at 2 o'clock. A mother who smothered her Down syndrome son is spared jail.
And council tax warning, bills in England could rise by 10% next year unless the government provides more funding.
Hello, good afternoon. David Blunkett has resigned as Work and Pensions Secretary after sustained criticism that he broke the ministerial code by taking jobs in business without consulting a special committee. Speaking at a news conference, he said he had made mistakes and was now paying the price, but he insisted it had been his decision to go.
Well, earlier, Tony Blair described Mr Blunkett as a decent and honourable man who'd left office with no stain of impropriety against him whatsoever. It's, of course, the second time in under 12 months that Mr Blunkett has resigned from the Cabinet. He quit as Home Secretary last December over the handling of a visa application for his former lover's nanny. Let's cross live now to John Sopel, who's at College Green for us, through a dramatic day so far. John, over to you.
Yeah, Matthew, there's a sort of faint sense of déjà vu about events like this, but each drama unfolds in a very different manner, and this one has got its own character altogether. We've had a news conference where David Blunkett has sought to answer all the questions that we're all asking, and yet you somehow come away from it feeling more confused than you did at the beginning. That he rang Downing Street, said he wanted to see the Prime Minister this morning, but wasn't clear in his own mind about whether that he needed to resign. This is his version of events. He then went back to Portcullis House, one of the MP's office blocks, where he reflected after his discussion with the Prime Minister, and that was when he decided that yes, he did have to go after all. But what happened in that moment between leaving Downing Street, returning to his office and deciding that he did have to go? Because apparently, according to the Prime Minister, according to David Blunkett, there was no call for him to resign. These questions will be pored over. Maybe there are other revelations that we don't know about. Maybe it was a Damascene conversion almost that Mr Blunkett had. But there are still many people trying to ponder, trying to work out why, if the initial offence wasn't that grave, did Mr Blunkett feel that finally he had to leave the government one more time. On today's events, here's our political correspondent, Sean Lay.
David Blunkett had promised to come out fighting today.
You're an embarrassment to the Prime Minister, Mr Blunkett.
But his silence as he left home this morning was perhaps a harbinger of what was to come. The car should have been taking him to appear before a committee of MPs. Instead, he was diverted to Downing Street. The committee was told he'd been delayed. In fact, on 2 separate occasions, he went into number 10. By the time he finally emerged, Westminster was awash with rumours. Confirmation came at 11 o'clock. David Blunkett had resigned for the second time in less than a year.
I think David had come to a simple conclusion, that the drip, drip, drip was making his position untenable, was damaging the government, and I think that is a measure of the man that he put the government first and his own position second.
His departure before lunchtime's Prime Minister's questions certainly saved Mr Blair from having to defend his position. Instead, he was able to pay tribute to a fallen comrade.
When it's from somebody that has done an immense amount for this country, I think as he goes from government, we should say he goes, in my view, with no stain of impropriety against him whatever.
But the Conservative leader suggested the resignation demonstrated something more significant, the erosion of Mr Blair's authority.
And I quite understand why the Prime Minister's judgment in these last few days has been awry. I can entirely sympathise with his desire to cling on to the right honourable gentleman, the member for Sheffield Brightside. Isn't it a fact that he was one of the Prime Minister's last remaining allies in the Cabinet.
The Liberal Democrat leader wondered if a row over policy was the real cause of the resignation.
It was well reported recently, Mr. Speaker, that the now former Secretary of State for the Department of Work and Pensions and the Prime Minister disagreed over incapacity benefit reform.
It is absurd to say that incapacity benefit that is now costing £13 billion a year, where we've got 3 million people economically inactive in this country, doesn't need reform. It does need reform. This side has got the courage to do it, and as ever, when it comes to a policy decision, the Liberal Democrats lack that courage.
Minutes later, David Blunkett explained why he'd decided the Prime Minister would have to manage that reform without him.
I stepped down today precisely to protect the government from diversion from the policies that we're carrying out, from the reforms we're bringing in. And I don't think you need to be a genius to recognise that the events, not just of the last few days, but of the last few weeks, have certainly been a diversion.
But whatever the cause, it's an ignominious end to the career of a politician once seen as a possible Labour leader. Sean Lay, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, Mr Blunkett has been under relentless pressure in the press, of course, but also in the House of Commons. His chief tormentor, if you like, was Chris Grayling, the shadow leader of the House. And I asked him a short time ago whether he felt satisfied that he's got his man.
I think it's the right thing to have happened. I think it was inevitable after what's happened in the past few days, after a series of misjudgments by Mr Blunkett that really nobody in his position should do. At the same time, it is the end of a distinguished political career. I mean, he has overcome enormous adversity, has reached the highest levels of political office, and on a day when his career has clearly come to an end, we mustn't forget that. He's achieved a lot and deserves credit for that.
He confessed that he had breached the ministerial code, but he hadn't misused his position in any way. Was it really a hanging offence?
The question that I always asked about this, to which even today, in the references that both the Prime Minister and Mr Blunkett have made to the issues and questions I raised, was never about Mr Blunkett making representations as Secretary of State on behalf of this company. I never believed for a moment he would be that stupid. The issue was that he continued to have private meetings with members of that company, with shareholders, members of the family who own the shares in DNA Bioscience. That seemed to me a monumental error of judgment, both in the context of the ministerial code and what people would have expected from somebody in government office. His family still owns substantial shareholding. The company was seeking business from his department and other government departments. I think it was just a daft thing to do.
Unless I misheard him, he said that he made no representations on behalf of them once he became a minister.
Now, I've never made the suggestions he made representations on behalf of the company once he became a minister. What I've said is that allegations have been made against him by his former girlfriend, which Mr Blunkett has denied. They are serious allegations. That merits an independent inquiry. That's what I've said all the way through. I don't know what was said at those meetings. I think it was extremely foolish to have those meetings in the first place. I don't think he should have done that. I have no knowledge, nor could I have any knowledge of what was said at those meetings. But I think the fact that they took place and the allegations being made meant an inquiry was inevitable. Actually, today's announcement has superseded that.
Allegations have been made. He's denied them. Where's the hanging offence? That's my central question.
Well, the hanging offence is a series of misjudgments. Bear in mind that I never called for Mr Blunkett to resign. What I said is that we've got a series of serious misjudgments, of serious questions which need to be answered. There needs to be a proper independent inquiry into this. I also expressed my view, which I held then and I held subsequently, that I didn't see how Mr Blunkett, given his errors of judgment, given the fact he'd broken the ministerial code, could end up after that inquiry continuing to be in the government. But nonetheless, there should be an inquiry first. That was only fair and due process.
Do you think that he jumped or was he pushed?
Difficult to tell. I mean, there are conflicting rumours around Westminster at the moment suggesting he may have been pushed by the Prime Minister. Unless anybody should doubt my involvement in all of this, I would turn them to the comments made this morning by Lord Nolan. Lord Nolan was the architect of the public standards watchdogs in this country today. I think the decisive point for the Prime Minister would have been when he saw Lord Nolan criticising Mr Blunkett and saying something has to be done, otherwise the rules have no meaning. I think that's the real tipping point.
Just very briefly, what's the reaction of your fellow MPs? Are they patting you on the back and saying, well done, old boy, you've got a big scalp, or is there sort of rather embarrassment feeling, almost a sense of Pity for Mr Blunkett?
A bit of both, I think, is the answer to that. And in my position, I'm certainly not feeling triumphant today. I'm doing my job as an opposition politician. People look to the opposition to oppose, to challenge the government to ask difficult questions of ministers over policy and over their conduct. That's what we're there for. Without us, you have no opposition and we're not a proper democracy. But that does not mean at the end of all this, I don't feel a slight sense of, God, we've actually seen the end of a pretty impressive political career today, albeit as a result of misjudgments, albeit as a result of things he should not have done. But at the end of the day, you can't help but admire the guy for what he achieved as well.
So it was misjudgment, not wrongdoing?
Well, breaking the ministerial code is a wrongdoing. If you break the ministerial code, you should accept the consequences. I think it was a combination of the two. There's no doubt he broke the ministerial code, that was wrongdoing. There were also a series of unanswered questions and a series of misjudgments which compounded all of that. And I think at the end of the day, there was just too much for him to carry on.
Shadow Leader of the House, Chris Grayling, talking to me a short time ago. In the 1970s, there was a reggae song called There Are More Questions Than Answers. It seems strangely appropriate today, following the sort of gaps that we still have in our understanding of what made David Blunkett stand down. Let's cross live now to Downing Street to our chief political correspondent, James Landale, who might try to answer some of those questions. There do seem to be still so many unanswered questions in this, don't there, James?
There do indeed. There was also that famous Aswad reggae song that said things are getting worse every day, and I think that's certainly one of the things that Downing Street felt, that the slow drip drip basically meant that he had to go. The key question though is this, is what was it that suddenly caused David Blunkett to have this Damascene conversion as he left Downing Street earlier this morning, when, according to his account and according to the Prime Minister's account, he had said to the Prime Minister, look, I'm quite concerned about this, I may have to go. The Prime Minister says, no, stay for a bit, think about it. And he was headed back, and suddenly he decided, no, my position is untenable, and came back to Downing Street for a second time to tell the Prime Minister. That is the key question that we do not know today. Precisely why did David Blunkett suddenly decide that his position was untenable?
He made some reference in his news conference to the fact that people had been digging around and that he had been reminded to make other declarations to the Register of Members' Interest. Do we know what he meant by that?
No, we don't. I mean, that was the key question that underlay a lot of this story this week. Was there something else to come out? The Sunday newspapers obviously would have been digging for some time. In terms of the 3 jobs that he had, well, we knew about them in as much as they were declared in the Register of Interest. But if he felt something else was going to come out, either about his personal life or about his business dealings, then he might have thought, well, look, better to go now than let all of this drag on. And if he told the Prime Minister that, then that might have been a convincing argument for the Prime Minister to say, OK, enough's enough.
James, inevitably today we focused on the personality of David Blunkett and the sort of drama, the personal drama, the political drama that has unfolded around us this morning and maybe these past 48 hours. But in terms of policy, this is a vital area for the government, isn't it?
Absolutely crucial. David Blunkett had, I say now, until this morning, 2 crucial pieces of government work on his desk. One was welfare reform, above all, how you reform incapacity benefit. It costs this British state £13 billion a year of payments to people who are on incapacity benefit, and the Prime Minister has, as he said at Prime Minister's questions, is determined to get that figure down and spend the money he thinks in a better way, and therefore a crucially important issue to get right politically, because effectively if you get it wrong you alienate a huge chunk of people who receive this benefit and who vote, and that was causing a lot of unrest amongst Labour MPs who were very concerned about losing votes. The other big issue, pensions. We know that Adair Turner, who's heading up a big review of pensions, is due to report on the 30th of this month. The government has to come up with some kind of decision in the next 6 months or so about what may or may not happen about that. Very, very, very important decision, the ageing population. Are we going to have to work a little bit longer? Are we going to have to save a bit more? Should any of these things be compulsory? All of them big issues, and David Blunkett was in charge of them, and he was a wounded minister, and effectively he took the view this morning. He said that there was a diversion, if you like, from the reforms he was carrying out and the policies he was trying to pursue, and therefore he had to go. The big question now is who takes on that role, and there are a fair number of people in the frame who have been touted already. One man being mentioned this morning by some MPs is David Miliband, who's currently in charge of council tax and the Respect agenda over at the office of the Deputy Prime Minister. Other people talked about the Cabinet Office Minister, John Hutton. I have to say, 20 minutes ago, even John Reid, bless his cotton socks, The Defence Secretary went into that door. John Reid has had an awful lot of jobs in government. He's been at Health, he's been at Northern Ireland, he's been at Defence and so forth. Could it be John Reid? I mean, it would be a big risk, but if the Prime Minister said, no, I want a big hitter in that job, somebody who I can trust, somebody who can take on that man over there in number 11 Downing Street, the Treasury, because pensions and benefit reform have crucial implications for the public purse and they cost a lot of money, and there are lots of decisions about where the extra money goes to. So those are all the decisions the Prime Minister has to make now. What I'm told by people who have been involved in this process before is in circumstances like this, the Prime Minister wants to contain. He wants to make the ripples as small as possible. So don't expect big changes.
OK, James, we will watch this very closely indeed on this rather rainy, blustery day here at Westminster. And of course, you'll be able to have your say with the political editor of the Daily Telegraph, George Jones. He'll be with me here in around 15 minutes at 2:30, where you can see there the numbers if you want to get in touch with us and raise the issues of the day concerning David Blunkett's resignation, the rules concerning ministers, maybe some of the issues concerning work and pensions that James Landale was just talking about. So do join us for that. In the meantime, back to you in the studio.
John, thanks very much indeed.
Straight to breaking news from Iraq, and we're hearing that a car bomb has killed 20 people and injured 45 at a Shiite mosque in the town of Musaib. That according to Iraqi police and hospital sources. This in the last few minutes, a car bomb at a Shiite mosque. It's killed at least 20 people and injured 45.
Now, Musaib is south of Baghdad, and it was the scene in July of a suicide bomber who blew himself up at a gas station, at that point killing 54 people and wounding over 80. But we're now hearing today a car bomb exploding, killing 20 and wounding 45. Those are the latest details we have. We'll bring you more as we get them. Now, a mother who killed a 67-year-old woman who admitted the manslaughter of her son, who suffered from Down syndrome on the grounds of diminished responsibility, has been spared prison. Oxford Crown Court heard that Wendelin Marcrow had reached the end of her tether after 36 years caring for him. Now, imposing a suspended jail sentence, the judge said it was a profoundly sad case. Quotes, a real tragedy. Our correspondent Sophie Hutchinson is outside Oxford Crown Court for us. What were the circumstances behind this, Sophie?
Well, the circumstances were that Wendy Marcrow had cared for her son for 36 years. In fact, in the last 10 years, she had almost been his sole carer and given up her part-time job. And as he had got older, he had Down syndrome. He was born with Down syndrome. He also had some autism. But in his late 20s, early 30s to mid-30s, he had become increasingly difficult, and his behavioural issues were very, very hard to handle. He had been self-harming himself to the point of actually losing sight in one eye, punching himself in the face, and he'd also been yelling and shouting a lot and only sleeping for about 2 or 3 hours a night. So it was very, very tough on Mrs. Marcrow looking after him. She said she simply snapped last Easter in the middle of the night when he was shouting and screaming. She gave him 14 tranquilizers to try and calm him down. That when that didn't work, she simply got a supermarket plastic bag, she put it over his head and she suffocated him.
And she was supported in court by other members of her family.
Absolutely. We heard from her son, Martin Marcrow. He stood up and he told the court that he had had an idyllic childhood, that she had been the most fantastic mother, and that she had cared for his brother Patrick, who in the end she admitted to killing, 100%, that she wanted him to be looked after properly. And he said he and his family absolutely supported his mother 100%, and that they had had no idea about the pressure that she was suffering.
And what about support that the family received from social services, for instance?
They did receive some support, and there were a number of day centres that Patrick actually went to. But Mrs. Marcrow said that he was often very unhappy when he came back from those day centres, that she was concerned that he was sometimes being bullied. And she decided in the end that it was actually easier for her. He was calmer when he was just simply at home all day. So she took him out of those. But after he lost his sight in one eye, she appealed time and time again to the authorities, saying she was in a crisis, that they needed some extra help. help. And one of the key workers wrote to one of her colleagues saying this was an urgent situation, that something absolutely had to be done. Well, a year later almost, that was when Patrick was killed by his mother. So the family feels not enough was done. On the other hand, social services are saying they did everything in their power. They offered her support and often she turned it down.
Sophie, thank you very much.
Just gone 2:15, our main headlines here this afternoon. David Blunkett has resigned from government for the second time in 12 months. He said he'd done nothing wrong, but wanted to protect the government.
Tony Blair said he reluctantly accepted the resignation after talks at Downing Street. Mr Blunkett told the Prime Minister he believed his position was untenable.
As you just heard in other news, a mother who killed her Down syndrome son will not be going to jail. Gwendolyn Marcrow, who smothered her son Patrick, was given a suspended sentence.
And in sport, there's more Champions League football this evening, and Manchester United have the opportunity to try and recapture some form. So Alex Ferguson's team is playing against Lille at the Stade de France in Paris. Arsenal know a win over Sparta Prague at Highbury this evening will seal the Gunners' place in the next round with 2 games to spare. And England's top referee Graham Poll has been disciplined for an incident that occurred at a pre-season training camp for officials. More details on those stories coming up in 30 minutes. See you then.
Francis, see you then. Thanks very much. Now, the government's anti-terrorist legislation is currently being debated this afternoon in the House of Commons. Let's go live to the chamber, show you a little of the scene. Ken Clark there on his feet, just speaking about the proposals that have been so controversial in the last few months, with a lot of opposition to what Charles Clark has been putting forward. So let's just go through some of the background to these proposals that have been put forward, because the most contentious proposal involves extending the maximum length of time a suspect can be held without charge from 14 days, as it stands now, to 3 months. The Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats are strongly opposed to this, but the Home Secretary Charles Clark has said he's open to compromise. Labour rebels have tabled an amendment reducing the detention period to 28 days. There'll also be votes on other controversial aspects of this legislation, including proposals for new offences of inciting and glorifying terrorism. Well, let's consider this a little further with our security correspondent, Gordon Carrera. And Gordon, the 90 days is what so much of the focus will be on in the Commons and has been for months. Just explain a little of why the security forces, the police, want 3 months and not 2 weeks.
Well, this is primarily driven by the police, and they've said that they feel there's a need for this 90-day period because the nature of the terrorist threat has changed. Well, what they say is that, for instance, when they go into a property and seize computers or hard disks, it takes time to unlock them because of the encryption on them. Secondly, they may have trouble getting into properties because of the threat of some kind of chemical or biological agent, so it could take days or weeks for them to get into a property of a suspect. And finally, there's a kind of global footprint to terrorism these days, which means that when they're looking for evidence to charge someone, that evidence may be in Saudi Arabia, it may be in Pakistan, it may be in Algeria, it may be in Egypt. And so that for all these reasons, 14 days, they say, isn't enough to collect enough